Hi, yeah, I'm John Delaney. I served as general counsel for the city of Jacksonville in the early 90s and then was mayor from 1995 to 2003 and then just stepped down after 15 years as president of the University of North Florida.
So we're talking about consolidation and from your point of view, having seen it from several perspectives, how do you think it has worked?
Well, really, as a general counsel and also mayor, was sort of a student of consolidation, and it's a tremendous success. And there's so many efficiencies that are built into this. What Jacksonville really would have looked like is Arlington would have been a city, the South Side would have been a city, Mandarin would have been a city, Arlington would have been a city. North, you would have had that. In Dade County, they have some 36 cities inside that county.
Right.
And so, most citizens just driving down the road don't care which city they happen to be in. But from a governance standpoint, it's been tremendously workable. A couple of downsides. There was sort of a dilution of the minority vote, the African American vote. And then I always said that neighborhoods kind of got left behind, because if you were an individual city, you'd be dealing with the landscaping and the roads and those kinds of things. And so felt that you really need to continue to focus on neighborhoods. That's where people live, even though you have this big county government, city-county government.
Structurally, in terms of the government, yeah, how old were you in 1967? You were still in high school.
Yeah.
So you weren't involved in...
Actually, wasn't. I didn't move to Jacksonville until '72, so it was as a kid in high school, right?
But some people who criticize consolidation may not be really criticizing the form of government, the way it was designed, but some of the people who have been elected to run it.
Well, that's always the case, is whether you have a bunch of small cities, we suffer if we elect poor leaders. And frankly, in the new climate where the local media has had a harder time being a watchdog of local government, I think it's even more dangerous. And but by and large, I think the cities really are led by whoever happens to be mayor. I mean, they set the tone for the community, and a mayor rarely loses on an initiative that they try to get through. And by and large, mayors, all of the mayors, have been able to leave some implant on the progress of the city. Hans Tanzler was the first consolidated mayor, we call it, and he led the merging of the permitting departments and the police department, the county sheriff and the city chief of police, and really was masterful at that. And then Jake Godbold was one who kind of gave he was fighting Jacksonville's inferiority complex. He was trying to get some enthusiasm about how wonderful this place was, and planted the seed for an NFL football team. And he did a lot of infrastructure work as well. Tommy Uzuri followed that, and Jacksonville had a horrendous odor. I mean, it was a horrific smell. He eliminated that, and then he knocked down toll booths, which were the bane of my existence, having to stop and drop a dime or a quarter into those toll booths. Now they've got it automated, so they wouldn't have quite the impact, but that actually generated more revenue for infrastructure. And although we complain about our traffic jams, we really have a better traffic flow than most any other city in the country. It also kind of modernized the management of City Hall. John Payton, I'm in between, but John Payton dealt with that massive recession that was crippling the governments across the country, and diversified the revenue streams. And so Alvin Brown and Lenny, our current mayor, worked on that pension issue, and ultimately it was Lenny Curry that found the solution. So people have made moves all the way across the board.
We'll talk a little bit about your terms of office as mayor, the highlights, and so forth.
Well, at the time, I focused on the management of the government. That started with Mayor Ed Austin, and we actually reduced the city workforce by between a quarter and a third, with no layoffs. It was all through, attrition, some privatization and outsourcing and those sorts of things. So really led to a far more efficient government, and allowed us to cut the tax rate by 10%. And also the state in the last 10 to 15 years has really crippled the local revenue. They have exempted properties from taxation and set different thresholds. So those cuts were done while you were really losing revenue from that as well. Some would say wish it was higher now. At the time we didn't need that money. We passed a big infrastructure plan, what we call the Better Jacksonville Plan, which did the arena downtown and the baseball park, the courthouse, the library, did dozens of libraries across the county. I always wanted a kid to be able to walk or bike ride to a library, and so we were trying to develop those, and worked big environmental components as well. The preservation project, which was a massive land buying scheme. Jacksonville, I'm rough on these numbers, maybe had 20 square miles of parks. It now has over 100 square miles of park space and preserve space. And that preserve space, just the preserve space, is actually bigger than the city of Miami or the city of Newark, the whole city. So we've got really one of the most amount of park space of any city in the country. And that probably is going to be appreciated more in the decades down the year when we've pulled that land out of development and it's preserved, that beauty and naturalness is preserved.
And not only your term, but others, what are the failures, the things that didn't happen that you would like to have seen?
Yeah, I think the two big downsides was that as what we call the old core city is what we refer to it, which is the original city of Jacksonville, and it was unincorporated outside that in Duval County. Eventually, that unincorporated area would have developed a series of cities. But there was massive white flight. The 60s was a turbulent time for Jacksonville.
And everywhere else in the country.
That's true, everywhere else in the country. But our school system lost its accreditation. We had a sheriff that had been indicted. Massive numbers of city council and county commissioners got indicted. The utility rates for electricity were going through the roof. There was white flight that was all across the country, that whites were moving to the suburbs. And so it was pretty clear that as the African American population as a percentage went up in the old core city, that we would have had an African American mayor. And so one of the downsides was that there was sort of a dilution of this minority vote. We've since elected an African American mayor and an African American sheriff, despite the fact that it's between 25, that population is between 25 and 30% of the overall. The second big downside is neighborhoods, is the neighborhood's identity. When I was mayor, we tried to focus on that. We had a massive neighborhood agenda, and you can see some of the work that was done in 5 Points, in the town center area at the beach between Neptune Beach and Atlantic Beach, the San Marco area. Some of these pockets and nodes that you really kind of wanted to get some nice retail and shops and things like that, landscaping to help identify those neighborhoods and make it have a sense of community. So structurally, those are probably the two big things, is that it's a much bigger bureaucracy. We set up a call center. We really kind of copied what some corporations have done. And the idea was you wanted to get that phone answered within a minute, and we wanted to fill a pothole within, I think it was 24 hours. It may have been 48 hours. People talk about a pothole in front of their house. And you tried to get it where you kept that small town feel, despite the fact that this is the 13th largest population for a city in the country. We're really bigger than Boston and Miami in population. They've got that metro area outside that is a bunch of smaller municipalities.
Yeah. It would be speculation, of course, to think about what Jacksonville would be like without consolidation. Some things have happened, and we kind of give some credit to consolidation, NFL, et cetera, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think economic development is a lot tougher in a county that has a lot of different municipalities.
Right.
Often the city of Orlando is fighting Orange County. Tampa fights its county, Hillsborough County, and also fights kind of against St. Pete. And they actually will use economic incentives to move a company across the bay. In this case, you don't have that, and so having really one economic development location is a massive, massive advantage. It can be a little clunky as it works its way through a city council, but that's the nature of democracy. The JEA, the electric utility, then the electric utility, because the property values had collapsed in the old core city as people moved to the suburbs, and with it went office parks instead of the offices downtown, and you didn't have as much of the downtown residential because you had the suburban housing developments. All of that went that way. One of the ways that the old core city survived was jack up the electric rates because the city owned the electric utility. So would we have been able to fix those electric rates as had happened by the time the 80s and 90s rolled around? It would have been a lot harder, I think, if you didn't have consolidation. It would have been a much different looking place. I don't think we could have pulled off an NFL team. I'm not sure that would have worked. Even now there is some resistance in the suburbs to investments in the downtown, and I have been sympathetic to that. I went through kind of a thought process. Maybe downtowns are entertainment complexes and government buildings in a mid-sized American city. But I realized to really have an identity, you needed to have something downtown. If you have one of any amenity, you'd like that in your downtown area, with the exception of a landfill and an airport. Those you want you want outside of the downtown area. And so I think the journey for the city has been a good one. Occasionally a little herky-jerky, mayors, because there's term limits, and there should be. They have different agendas, so we don't have sometimes a continuity on, say, downtown development, or a little different focus on economic development. When I was in office, I wanted to focus on economic development in the north and west part of the city county. That's where we had more of the poverty, and people needed jobs and didn't necessarily have the transportation to get to where the growth was going in the south side and the Mandarin area. Subsequent mayors have changed that wherever somebody wants to move, yeah.
That agenda remains to be accomplished, right?
Yeah, well, elections have consequences, and so, for each thing that maybe I would disagree with a mayor, there's a lot of things that I agree with what the mayors have done to try to move the city ahead.
The City Council had a committee that took a look at consolidation recently, a few years ago, and I guess didn't find any major problems that needed to be addressed, but anything can always be tweaked, I guess. What are your thoughts on any changes?
Yeah, when the city consolidated, when you had these massive indictments of city council members and county officials, the business community kind of rallied and said, we've got to come up with a different form of government that's more accountable and less opportunities for corruption. And they put together a blueprint, or a blue book.
Right.
And most of those recommendations went into play, but not all of them. There was a big issue over whether or not the sheriff should be independently elected, or should that be appointed by the mayor. I think political scientists often would say you want the mayor to be accountable. So what we've seen down the years is sometimes the mayors and the sheriff are butting heads over a budget. And the sheriff is a significant portion of the overall city-county budget as it is. And if there was a police chief, you wouldn't see that happening. You don't see the fire department fighting with the mayor over a budget. You will the sheriff. And
if they had decided, the founding fathers of consolidation, to call that person a police chief instead of a sheriff, maybe it could have been pulled off.
Yeah, well,
think about having an appointed sheriff.
Right, and I think you're right on that. They didn't want to give up that title sheriff because that was kind of the component of the county, because it went to the county lines. A lot of people don't really realize that a police chief is typically appointed by a mayor or a mayor city council, and a sheriff is typically elected at the county level. I actually spoke to the review of consolidation, and people don't want to give up voting for something, and so I didn't think it was possible to pull off making a police chief as opposed to a sheriff. And our sheriffs have been almost uniformly popular down the years, and down the decades, I should say, and by and large, it's worked out.
And there hasn't been a lot of mayor-sheriff friction.
There's been some with Mayor Payton and Sheriff Rutherford. There certainly was some. Usually it gets worked out. Nat Glover was sheriff when I was mayor, and we're very close friends. And I could go to Nat and say, look, I'm hurting this year. I can only do this. John, you got it. Next year, can you help me? Yep, we'll catch it up with these extra officers next year. So the sheriff is the big one, what we refer to as the constitutional officers. The other thing that they had recommended was that the tax collector, the property appraiser, supervisor of elections, clerk, that those offices should also be appointed by the mayor. They're very much ministerial offices, almost clerical offices. There's not an appetite to do that among the public, but probably you'd have some more efficiencies if those were appointed as opposed to elected, but it's just not quite doable. And those are probably the most significant recommendations of the original group that didn't get put into place. But by and large, that blueprint has worked out well for the people that live in Northeast Florida.
And you've always been interested in government and history. So at a certain point, I guess soon after you moved to Jacksonville, you became aware that Jacksonville had this very unusual kind of government. Little did you realize that you'd be running it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. when I first moved to Jacksonville, I didn't like it in 1972. I was a junior in high school. The city smelled. Downtown was in the process of dying, and it kept getting worse. And didn't really have plans on coming back after college. But I met and married my wife in 1980. She was from the beach here, and she got pregnant pretty quickly. And she said, "I want to raise this kid near my mother, so you better get a job in Jacksonville." 14 years later, I'm there, and love the place. I'll never live anyplace else.
Well, as you became more and more familiar with it, I guess you began to really appreciate it. The fact that it was probably one of the things that I think we have discussed is why haven't other places, why haven't more other places done it?
I think most people that live this is the only government they know, and so they don't really think about there's a city and a county. You know, St. Augustine has a distinct government from St. Johns County. And so I think we take it for granted. Often on the 25th anniversary, tried to kind of do a celebration, and it was kind of met with a collective yawn from people by what's the big deal. But it really took probably getting into City Hall to really appreciate how different this was than the way other cities and counties are structured. And to not see the fights between cities and counties over where to do economic development projects and those, where infrastructure, where you put roads and bridges, because each government's going to want to have a little different, kind of a responsibility. In the 60s, there was a movement on it. It became very aware. Indianapolis and Nashville followed similar models to consolidate, not the exact same model as Jacksonville. And then they just essentially have died. There's been Gainesville and Alachua County have talked about it a couple times, but have not been able to pull it off. That may be, too, that the city of Gainesville is dramatically different than the county, which is very rural and very conservative in Alachua County. And the city is, really the bulk of the population is tied to the University of North Florida. So that may just be a massive cultural thing. Where in Nashville, like Jacksonville, virtually everybody that lived in the more rural areas or suburban areas worked inside the county. But since then, you're correct, there has not been a move to do that. Although virtually every year when I was mayor, some city came to visit us and ask about it and say, "Can you walk us through the model?" And we'd hand them a copy of the blueprint and tell them how it happened. And with us, of course, it was triggered by scandal as much as anything else.
I was going to say, indeed, that may have been the tipping point, and they don't have that quote unquote advantage.
Yeah. There's the saying that never miss an opportunity to take advantage of a scandal, and often that's where you see reforms when finally Americans go, "We've had it. We want to do something different here." And it may have been why we have the president we've elected, is people said, "I've had it. We want somebody dramatically different."
And in that August 1967 election, it passed by a good margin.
It did. You had what was dubbed the white hats, which were really largely driven by the business community, and really in Jacksonville, that the business community, when they kind of get behind something and say, "Hey, we want to fix this," mayors tend to kind of get that as part of an agenda, and so it was very popular when it passed, except among the African American community, who sensed that there dilution of authority and dilution of representation.
But if I'm not mistaken, black voters supported it.
I think
not by as big a margin.
Right. I think by in the low 50%, as I remember, and so it wasn't as wide as it was every place else, and there was pockets of dissatisfaction, elements of the rural areas saying, "Hey, I don't want to pay the higher tax," because the county was going to pay more taxes than the city. The cities would be able to lower it. As it turned out, everybody's taxes went down.
And the kind of interesting compromise that enabled Beaches and Baldwin to retain their identity and so forth, that seemed to help, and you think that has worked?
Yeah, so roughly 5% of the population live in the three beach cities and Baldwin, and they kept large elements of independent municipal authority. And I live in one of those. I live in Neptune Beach, and I think the beaches feel an identity. It's that neighborhood sense of identity. People do know whether they live in Neptune or Jax or Atlantic, although you just drive up A1A and you go through 3 different cities. I think it has worked, but you've seen an element of consolidation. Atlantic Beach did away with its fire department and merged with the county. The county basically, that's when I was gradually that's happened. Neptune Beach had a volunteer fire department, and which really consisted of its police force, and so that sort of merged in. We dealt with garbage, that the city still have independent garbage contracts, but they use the county's landfill. But that had some tension. As you remember, the beach is sort of organized, and they wanted to become an independent county. Ocean County was what it was dubbed. There was no way to financially make it work, to have a jail and a courthouse and the things that you have to have when you're an independent county. And there's bond issues and things like that would have been a problem. But it got the attention of the county to say, hey, you know what, we haven't really been paying appropriate attention to provide county-type services to those three cities. And so we brokered a deal that at the time all three cities were happy with, and kind of did it proportionally, and it's worked out. I enjoy living where I am, and I enjoy kind of the county relationship with the city of Jacksonville.
And we mentioned race, and race is a recurring theme everywhere in the country, maybe particularly in the South. And the 60s were a difficult decade, to say the least. While we were going through governmental change, simultaneously there was all sorts of civil rights issues going on, including Jacksonville. So what are your thoughts? You mentioned that maybe those who are dissatisfied at this 50-year point would be primarily African American.
Well, and you're right, the 60s, and really, I often say the 60s really ran from 1965 to 1975. You know, that's when Bob Dylan went electric and the Beatles took off the jackets and let their hair grow longer. The music changed and the marches started and the anti-war movement developed. But there were race riots in virtually every mid-sized or bigger American city. Detroit was devastated. Boston had massive problems. I think Boston to this day is still the most segregated city in the country. Jacksonville actually is the most integrated city in the country if you look at the Census Bureau data. And so those tensions popped up everywhere. It was, you know, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of racism, the Jim Crow era in the South, as you mentioned. And I can remember finding a booklet that was an annual report for the city from the 1960s. And they talked about how many HUD units, housing units, had been built for whites, and a separate amount of housing units that were built for African Americans. I think they said colored back then. And the price per unit was dramatically different between the white and the black. The white units were better. And they were proud to report how many units they'd done and put the dollar figures in there. It was a mentality that needed to change. And so America really kind of woke up in the late 60s and early 70s, and it still is an issue, but I say that America in the end always gets it right. It just takes us a while, and we're still in process on race issues.
Well, any other things you would like to mention about consolidation?
I think you've covered it. You're of course, you reported on it and did editorials on the history of Jacksonville during that same time frame, and I'm glad you're doing this. You know, a lot of it's hard to find. There's only a handful that really appreciate that government. You and I did. Rick Delaney. The general counsels often are the ones, even sometimes more than the mayors, and Jim Reineman, some people that, you know, with that kind of still kind of enamored with Jacksonville's history. It's a really special thing that many people take for granted.
And we need to realize that most people who live here have never lived with anything but consolidation.
That's right. That's right.
So they kind of take it for granted.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Part of the mission is education.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. John Delaney, thank you very much.